Good afternoon. I think we are just about to start. It is my pleasure to introduce Celeste Kinginger, who is a professor of applied linguistics and French at Penn State University, where she teaches courses in second language acquisition, research methods, and French. And her research program focuses on qualitative variation in learning experiences and its developmental consequences for both language learners and their teachers. She lectures and publishes on a variety of related topics, including environments for language learning, cross-cultural autobiography, and foreign language teacher education. Without further ado, Celeste.
Let me see, is this fine? Can you hear me? Yeah, thank you very much for introducing me. I want to thank also the organizers of the conference for organizing this conference, which is exactly in the areas that interest me. And I'm thrilled. This is the first time I've been to a meeting that is entirely devoted to the topic that interests me most at the moment. So thank you very much for that and for the invitation. Also, thank you for inviting me to this beautiful place. Central Pennsylvania in the dead of winter really contrasts with this place, and I'm really looking forward to enjoying the weather and just the environment in general. So far, I've heard 4 very relevant, interesting papers at this meeting, and what I consider to be a brilliant opening keynote address. And so I'm very excited by this the whole event. Before I get down to business, and I promise you that I will do so promptly, I'd like to open my talk with a little bit of personal reflection about study abroad and the relationship between study abroad and learning language and culture. But I do promise that I will move on to the serious stuff very quickly. But as I'm talking, I would like you to be thinking about your experiences as well. You know, what sorts of things was study abroad as transformative an experience for you as it was for me? Okay. Now, when I was around 19 years old and an undergraduate at the then functioning Antioch College, I was sent by Antioch initially for a year in France, which was the typical, what was called earlier today the grand tour idea, the full year of study abroad that language majors typically did at that time. To preface the academic part of my study year abroad, Antioch sent me to satisfy their cooperative work. They had, at the time at least, a cooperative work requirement where students would have to spend half of their time actually working in various ways. So it was sort of like what we would call, what we now call a service learning arrangement. I was sent to work on a small family farm in the south of France for the summer preceding my enrollment at the university. The village where I lived was called Pouilly-par-Cornu. It had a wintertime population of between 12 and 25. But it was the summertime, so the village was populated with friends and family and merrymakers and people who were on vacation and so forth. I want to just talk a little bit about what, in retrospect, I believe I learned during that summer. And first of all, in the domain of taste, on the Lune family farm, I learned all kinds of things about French taste. I learned how to name the ingredients and the tools and the processes that led to the things that made it to the dinner table. I learned a great deal about the aesthetics of food. I learned, as an American, of course, I had no exposure to this whatsoever in the past. So I learned that, for instance, there's the right way to create certain dishes. When you make a vinaigrette, or you make a céleri remoulade, or you make a pot-au-feu, there is the correct way to do it, and you do not improvise, okay? I also learned that the meal is a highly orchestrated, sequential ritual event which is attended by, at least at the time, by everyone who was working on the farm, including the families and all the farm hands and anyone else who happened to be around. And you, during the meal, you sat and you made conversation with other people. When I first began cooking, I didn't have very many skills because obviously I was this bookish 19-year-old girl who had never willingly set foot on a farm before this experience. So I had to learn basically everything. When I first began cooking, I was exposed to all manner of speech acts for complaint in both formal and informal registers. And so I learned those. My hostess, her name was Madame Lune. I referred to her as Madame Lune. She had two key words at the time. For understanding Madame Lune, you needed to know the word gaspillage, which means wastefulness, and you needed to know the word fumiste, which was the word that the name she applied to anyone who was wasteful. Okay, particularly with their personal time. I see some laughter here in the front row. Okay, Madame Lune would apply these two words quite rigorously to all kinds of different situations, including the correct way to pick beans, for example, without ruining the bean bush. The thickness of my potato peelings would be criticized regularly using the word gaspillage and the word fumiste. But she taught me many things besides the food things. She taught me how to go to the market and pick out the right market piglet and what to do with it when we came home. She taught me how to deal with a herd of goats, how to take care of them, how to put them out to pasture, how to clean up after them, how to milk them, and then how to make cheese with the milk. She taught me how to cut and bale hay and how to store it in the barn. She taught me how to line the linen closet with lavender, because I think, and I don't know if she was aware of this, she was also teaching me pronunciation, right? And she would work on my nasal vowels with the expression "un brin de lavande sent bon dans le linge," right? So she taught me many things. She taught me reverence for physical labor. She taught me to respect people who work. She taught me all of these things about aesthetics. She taught me abhorrence for gaspillage, right? And I defy anybody to say that these experiences did not involve meaning. That is to say that there was no connection between the language that I was learning and the culture that I was learning in that context. I say it all the more because I now choose to live on a small farm. And when I pick my beans, Madame Lune haunts me, right? She's there she's standing there in whatever compartment my private speech is situated in, and she says to me, "Il faut pincer, il faut pas tirer. Vous allez abîmer les plantes." So with this said, I ruthlessly pirated a portion of Heidi Burns' abstract because I wanted to talk about more or less the same thing that she was going to be talking about at this conference, although from a completely different angle. This said, I agree with what she had to say about the language profession, that somehow over the years we've lost our way in terms of meaning, in terms of linking the forms of language to their meanings and therefore to the cultural knowing that goes on in second language users. And that I agree with her also that needs to be recovered, and that should be the agenda for us as foreign language teachers and researchers in the coming years. I'm not going to belabor this, but we see often in the literature the explanation for our blindness to meaning, coming from two philosophical sources which have informed our field and have had heavy influence on our field, certainly throughout the 20th century. The first being the structuralist emphasis on language as a system abstracted from use. If we study the history of linguistics and its relationship to the history of applied linguistics, we can see the reasons why this happened. We understand how Saussure was a genius for creating out of linguistics a science that could be equated with the natural sciences. We understand that. But as a result of this, we've wound up with a situation where when researchers study what goes on during learners' sojourns abroad, they're not really interested in what it means. They're only interested in what forms are being acquired, right? So, and study abroad, the purpose of study abroad is to increase students' access to high-quality input. Okay, now, there is a lot that can be said about whether or not high-quality input really is available to participants in study abroad or not. But what I'm questioning here is just the idea that we are reducing study abroad. All of those things that I was talking about before get reduced to the provision of high-quality input to a processing mechanism, in essence. The other branch is of philosophical, the other philosophical force that's in play is utilitarianism, which has been, at least since I joined the profession, has been a major force. We are, since President Carter's Commission's report, Strength Through Wisdom, which emphasized the functionality of language ability in the 1970s, we've been in a profession that's interested primarily in what students can do. How can they function in the language? Not why do they do it, not what does it mean to them when they do it, just what functions can they perform. Now, I see, in addition to the wonderful things that are coming out of the uses of systemic functional approaches in applied linguistics in the United States and elsewhere, I see other meaning-based approaches that are starting to make headway in our field. And I think this is really exciting, although I have yet, this is a little bit of a sidebar, since as far as I know, nobody in the study abroad literature has actually begun to use these approaches. But I'm hoping that they will begin to be integrated into the work on language learning and study abroad in the future. In addition to systemic functional approaches and cognitive linguistics, which, if you're familiar with the work of Andrea Tyler, is fascinating, linguistics that begins with meaning and then proceeds to form. And what I'm most familiar with, of course, is concept-based language instruction, which is what has been going on at Penn State over the past 10, 12 years, I'm not sure exactly how long, with the group that is involved in interested in sociocultural theory and Vygotskian approaches to language and to mind, essentially. We've had several really interesting dissertations which begin with meaning and then proceed to form. So, for instance, Negrella and Lantoff's work on Spanish grammar, Matt Poner's work on French grammar, a dissertation that was defended last month about English phrasal verbs. All of these are dissertations where the idea is that you assume that the students are, if they're college-aged adults, they're able to understand concepts. And you explain the concept, and then you proceed to the form. And I'm not here to talk about that, but it's a fascinating new way of organizing language pedagogy that we're starting to see coming out. My own student, Adam Van Kompernal, is going to be defending a thesis, I think in a few weeks, which is about French socio-pragmatics, where he begins not with the forms, not with the forms of address or the presence or absence of the negative particle ne, or not with the forms, but with the meanings that are encoded in those forms. So Adam has taught students, what does it mean? What is social hierarchy, and what does that mean? What is self-presentation, and how does that relate to language? And and in his dissertation, he therefore proceeds from meaning to form. I think this, this in particular might be something that would be very useful for students who are going abroad. All right, so a few years back, I went out to see what we knew about language learning and study abroad in general, and the project got larger and larger until finally it became a book. And in this book, I try to trace exactly what we do know about this issue. And so I talk about how we define outcomes. Very typically, we define them in terms of general constructs like proficiency or fluency, or different domains of communicative competence. Although there's more research in some areas than in others. We do have research on the development of grammatical competence, the development of actional competence or speech act ability, the development of discourse and sociolinguistic competence. We also have research that looks into the different settings that exist in study abroad and tries to characterize them, either through a purely qualitative approach or else through a dual approach that attempts to correlate the things that are going on in these settings with different forms of learning outcomes. So we have research on what goes on in the classroom, although not very much. More research on what goes on in the homestay, though again, not very much. And some research which attempts to characterize how learners circulate through informal settings, learning the language that they're studying. We also have research which is purely about language socialization and identity. And so what do we know in general? Okay, I had to conclude in this book that study abroad can have a positive impact in every domain of language learning. So if it has been somewhat difficult to show, for example, that in the domain of grammatical competence, a lot of studies show that students may develop their fluency at the expense of their ability to speak in grammatically accurate ways, for example, or at least that's the hypothesis that gets advanced. But if you look at the studies that define grammatical competence in very precise ways, even there you will see that study abroad can have a positive impact, and there's no reason to imagine why it couldn't. I'm thinking, for example, of Martin Howard's work. Instead of saying, I'm going to show that students develop the ability to manipulate tense and aspect in French as one big, thing, he breaks it down into different elements and to different particular features, and shows that the study abroad students are actually making more progress than the students at home, but in ways that need to be measured in very precise ways. So this is true throughout, throughout the domain of the research. Now, I say study abroad can have a positive impact in every domain of language competence. I don't say that study abroad will or must have this impact. And if you're at all familiar with any of the qualitative portrayals of American students, and even students from other places in studying throughout the world, you'll know that study abroad might not have this type of impact, and there are all sorts of reasons why that might be the case. If we have time, I'll get into that a little bit later on. But today, what I want to talk about is not that. I feel like I've talked about that enough already. But I want to talk about this major finding here, that study abroad holds significant potential for the development of social interactive abilities, that is, the sociolinguistic, discourse, and pragmatic abilities. And I'm talking now based just on what is out there up till now. So my questions are here. Where does meaning, and by extension, cultural knowing, the cultural knowing that Heidi Burns was writing about in her abstract, where does this make its way into the literature that I've been studying? And I just asked myself that question, and then I went looking to see what I would find. And then, of course, another question is, how might the profession expand its attention to language learning as intercultural learning in this setting? Okay, and that, I think, that's a very important question. Okay, I'm partly inspired by this. Some of you will remember Michael Agar's book on where he introduces the concept of languaculture, which I still think is a very ugly word, but it's a very useful concept. Agar was trying to get across the idea that we've been talking about here today, since this morning, that there really isn't a rational way to separate out these things, that you need a way to put them together in one word so people can start to really understand that this is not a matter of two separate foci. In the book that I'm citing here, Agar writes, he's an ethnographer, And he's not a language specialist in particular, although language has a great deal to do with his work. This is the book where Agar also writes about the ethnographic rich point. And I think this is also an important concept for people who are involved with students who go abroad. Ethnographic rich points they typically are pretty uncomfortable situations. There are problems that arise, when there's a conflict or there's a misunderstanding, and the parties to the misunderstanding don't know what's going on. They can't understand why there's a conflict. For Agar, these are problems, but they are also opportunities for learning. They're learning and in particular, learning about the relationships that exist, this languaculture relationship that he writes about. One of the rich points for Agar, which struck me, as very relevant, was the distinction between the forms of address for you in German. How do you say you in German? Anyone who speaks a European language knows that there are some problems with this. He says the grammar books that he consulted about this were clear as freshly washed crystal. And this is true also for French. I'm sure it's the same for other European languages as well. The grammar books will tell you, they will give you some rules of thumb about how to use this. And they'll say that the informal form, du, is for children or friends or relatives, and then sie is for everybody else. Okay. So Agar goes to Germany, and he gets himself in trouble. He has all kinds of problems. He makes all kinds of mistakes. In particular, he goes into great length of discussion about a colleague who was flirting with him, and he didn't notice it. Okay, she switched from the sie to the du in a purposeful manner that didn't even register for him. Okay, so. So I like his metaphor here, and we're going to see it again actually later on. He then writes about the social acrobatics he needed to restore harmony to his interactions after going through these misunderstandings based on the choice of an address form. Okay, so this is one instance where it's very clear that there's a relationship between the meaning and the form. Okay. Now I'm just going to put this up for whether or not we believe that pragmatics deserves to exist. Pragmatics, in pragmatics we typically discuss a difference between the forms that are available for students or learners to use and the meanings of those forms. And this distinction is expressed as a distinction between pragmalinguistics and sociopragmatics. Right, so pragmalinguistics are the actual resources for conveying communicative acts and relational or personal meanings. But sociopragmatics is the sociological side of this, according to Leach's definition. It's about the perceptions that underlie participants' interpretation and performance. And then when Casper and Rose wrote about this back in the early 2000s, they pointed out that sociopragmatics is about proper social behavior, which is one of the reasons maybe why it's been so hard for us to think about sociopragmatic issues in pedagogical contexts. Because when you're teaching someone sociopragmatics, you're teaching them how to behave. And you have to know how to behave yourself in order to do that. You have to know whose behavior is the behavior to be emulated, and so on. So it's a pretty complicated thing in the classroom. So I'm going to talk I'm going to talk a little bit about a series of studies that part of a little bit of my own work, and then some studies that I admire particularly. They're not in any particular. I'm not obeying the make it as recent as possible rule in this talk. I'm just going to talk about studies that I admire because of the insights that they bring to us about the study abroad context for connecting meaning and form. All right, so these are the studies. We talked a little bit about address forms in French and in German already. There's a similar thing going on in French. And so one of the things that you have to understand about these address forms is that their use is ambiguous always. They are, when you choose an address form, either tu or vous or du or sie, you're doing at least two things. you're making a reference to the communicative situation that you're in. Right? We all know that there are certain situations which are more informal and others that are more formal, and usually the choice of address form will correspond in some way to the situation. But you're also indexing your own identity. Okay? And you know, if you follow Michael Silverstein's orders of indexicality, then you're also indexing. There are 3 orders of indexicality involved. In fact, you're also referencing the stereotypes that people hold about people who have the identity that's being indexed in the context that you're talking about. Okay, so just to give you an example, you know, tu in French it tends to index things like youth, or the appearance of youth, or the desire to appear youthful. So an older person who overuses tu is going to be perceived as someone who's trying to act young. It also indexes left-leaningness, and you know, a more progressive political outlook, that sort of thing. Vous, on the other hand, indexes basically the flip side of that. If you use vous a lot, you're trying to show your respect for tradition. You might be trying to show that you belong to a certain relatively bourgeois social class. You might be indexing your more right-wing political orientations and so forth. So you have all of these things going on, and the stereotypes that are associated with them in every interaction. And you know, be aware that you can't go around having social interactions with people in French and not use these forms very easily. It's, you know, you can do it, but it's tough. You really do need to know how to say you. Okay. Okay. So, you know, we have examples like one of the former presidents of France, Giscard, was known to call his dog vous. Yes. And we know that had nothing to do with the dog, right? And I know the people who were involved in the '68, situation, the student uprisings of 1968, are still calling everybody tu, you know, regardless. We know there are problems in workplaces. For example, when the boss insists that everybody in the organization be tu, and that hides a hierarchy, a power hierarchy that people feel uncomfortable about. So it's really it's a very interesting question. Tu and vous get more difficult with proficiency. The better you are at speaking French, the more difficult you think it is to choose, until you get to the point where you're truly an expert speaker, and then it's really hard. For native speakers, you know. No, but get this, I mean, for native speakers, this is also a problem. And people routinely complain about other people's use of these forms. There are literary works like Raymond Jean's Tutoiement, which is a whole collection of stories about things that went wrong when somebody chose to use the other form. Okay, so it's really not easy. We have the social acrobatics again here with Jean-Marc Dewal's article on this topic, saying that everybody who speaks French, native speakers and everybody is on what he calls a sociolinguistic tightrope, you know, trying to figure out which form to use. Here's another explanation. This is Calvet, back in 1976, talking about la longue marche vers une francophonie moyenne passe sous les forces codines du tu et du vous. Now, this is a reference to the historian Livy, writing of a particular battle when the army was marching through a chasm, and there were archers on either side, basically, ready to mow them down, and basically everybody died. So here's a graphic that shows you a little bit more about this. You know, I like this picture. Okay, so in my work, I worked with Kathleen Farrell and then independently, and we used what we called the study abroad language awareness interview. This was an attempt to understand what students knew about forms that they were using in French, and also about forms that we we were pretty sure they were not going to be using. So the language awareness interview included things about tu and vous, but also things about colloquial French that students might not feel comfortable actually using, even if they knew the words. We also tried to do some things with genre awareness, but that was too hard for our students. So we had 23 participants who were in France for 1 semester, and our results show that obviously, the first thing is that the students got much better at matching the use of their these forms to their informal and formal context that we used as illustration. But it gets more interesting. The students became less certain about how to use the forms, which we took as good news, right? So, and finally, the students in the group whose French was most advanced, when we talked to them about this issue, they revealed that they understood that they could choose. This is what Heidi Burns was talking about this morning. They had these resources at their disposition, and they could choose to express the identity that they wanted in particular interactions. So, for example, we had a participant whose name was Benjamin. Benjamin was very, very cosmopolitan to begin with. He was an army brat, and he had lived all around the world before he went to college. And he was placed in the home of a baron and baroness in a very upscale part of town. And Benjamin actually, learned to use vous and decided that he was going to continue to do so because he wanted to express that identity. Okay. Another study that I admire is Shardakova's study on apologizing in Russian. It's a study based on a discourse completion task, like many studies that are done in general, in pragmatics in general. Here's a typical item on the test. We won't. Okay, her participants. The design of this study was truly ingenious to my mind. She had native speakers of Russian, advanced learners who had gone to Russia and who hadn't gone to Russia, and intermediate students who had and hadn't gone to Russia. So this is the one study that I know of that actually, definitively proves that study abroad gives you things that you can't get elsewhere. Because what she found out was, in addition to having the students do the tasks, she also asked them how they interpreted the task. How bad is this? How much of an apology is required? Right? And she found big differences between the Russians and the Americans, and that the Americans, they might know the forms that were proper, they might understand the situation like a Russian would, if they had been abroad, not if they hadn't, and they might still choose not to do it the Russian way. Okay? That's a lot more sophisticated than many of the designs that we see in second language pragmatics research. Here's a study from my forthcoming book by Lucien Brown. He's looking at how non-native users of Korean craft a second language identity. And in particular, he's looking at the use of honorifics in Korean, the difference between these two levels of speech, which are invoked in every interaction. So you have what's called respect speech and half speech. Okay, and there are very strict rules about how these are used by expert speakers. At the end of their sojourn in Korea, all the participants were able to use these forms. They showed how they could use them in a discourse completion task, and also in interview data. They explained the forms very well and how they could use them and so forth. But this study, like other studies, showed that foreigner status conveyed some disadvantages in terms of learning how to use these forms. That because they were foreigners, the young men in this study were not necessarily expected to respect the norms and the rules concerning this, and other people also would not use respect speech with them when they should have ordinarily. But there were differences in the way the students reacted to this. Richard thought it was great. He thought it was an advantage, and he was ready to take up the sort of non-native speaker identity and use it for his advantage. Patrick, on the other hand, really internalized this whole issue of who at what age may be permitted to use half speech with me, and would get very offended if somebody was not properly situated to use this speech. Okay, this is a study which is an older study, but it's one of the only studies I know which is about high school students. who go abroad, and it's a case study of an Australian high school student who was in Japan for a year. And in the case study, you see things going on that are really very interesting in terms of the development of languaculture, okay, in the household where she was staying. Although we don't have data to show it, we have descriptions of the ways in which this student was counseled by the host family on getting up the courage to use polite style in a particular setting. The student was also party to the first language socialization practices of her host family with reference to the younger siblings. So she watched the younger children in the class get corrected and upbraided for not using correct speech, and through this she was then herself able to be socialized into proper use of certain forms of Japanese. And then this is one of my all-time favorite studies. This is, obviously, since I'm so interested in the socialization of taste, this is an excerpt from Margaret Dufon's work on the socialization of taste in Indonesia. And this is Bruce, who is a novice American learner of Indonesian with his host mother at the dinner table. And what you see here, if you look at the structure of this, it's an interaction around orienting to food. Bruce doesn't know what the food is. He doesn't know what it's called. He has no idea how to talk about it. And so you see the host mother in an interaction with Bruce, which looks exactly like the dialogues that we used to do the repetition and substitution drill we used to do back when we were practitioners of the audiolingual method, except it's real. Okay, so it's very interesting. So for Dufon, she saw that socialization of taste included, what Bruce was just doing in the excerpt, orienting to the food, learning about food, what is the pleasure of food, how can food be pleasurable. Bruce also attempted to cook for his host family, and they came out and said, Bruce, why is this tasteless? Bruce, why doesn't this have any flavor? And she doesn't think he understood what they were saying, but he did get it that they didn't like his spaghetti, because they took it back to the kitchen and brought it back the next day cooked the right way. Food is identity marker. There are different, the rituals involving food, gift giving, the economic value of food, and also the relationship between food and health, which I think is a really interesting subject to study. And I'm thinking now about Jane Jackson's participant. I think it was Ada, who thought her host family was trying to poison her with the endless burnt toast and the endless sandwiches. Right? Yeah. She was a Hong Kong a Chinese student from Hong Kong studying in the United Kingdom. Okay. Hassel's study. I'm not going to say too much about it, but I'm going to suggest that you read it. It is absolutely fascinating. He goes into Indonesia to improve his skill in Indonesian, but there is no guidance whatsoever on how to say goodbye. He only has one form, and when he gets there, he realizes that there are two, but he doesn't know how they work. So he tells the story in the article that he writes about this, of how he goes around, he wanders around in these different interactive settings, trying to figure out what these forms mean. And I was thinking this morning, as Heidi Burns was talking about, how we make things so much more difficult for our students, and this is the case of that, where if only somebody had given him a clear explanation of the difference between the two forms from the outset, then he would have, he might not have been able to use it, right away, but he certainly would have gotten a head start. I'll skip this too. I want to talk a little bit about missed opportunities in the study abroad research. We see in the qualitative research lots of useful perspectives, especially in relation to the individual differences that surface in almost every study that we see that tries to measure what's going on in study abroad. However, I don't think there are enough studies that address students' understanding of the language that they're acquiring and its cultural meaning. That is to say, we have lots of very interesting qualitative ethnographic studies, but they're not about the language part. They're not about learning language, even though we often ask students to record their language learning experiences, and that doesn't usually somehow work. Most of the studies that we have in the United States, at least, focus on the perspective of students only. And I want you to think about this for a minute. when you send a newcomer, a novice, into a situation, by definition, that novice does not understand what is going on. So if you have the student going into the situation, recording what they observe, reporting it to the so-called ethnographer, the ethnographer then writing it down and publishing it, what we wind up with is a literature that's about how the rest of the world is crazy. We don't have the perspective of the host families, we don't have the perspective of the educators, we don't have the perspective of any of the community members that are involved in the settings where our students are studying. And I think this is a bad problem. I'm going to skip that. I'm going to skip this too, excuse me. I'm also going to skip this. This is, okay, I accuse myself of this as well. I accuse some other people of it, but I will blame myself as well. In my study about Alice, for example, here's Alice in her college classroom. She's had trouble finding the classroom in the first place, and she's really mad. So she's recording her impressions of France in her journal. Now, I tried to situate this in reference to what I know about, French institutions and in particular French universities. But you can imagine that if I hadn't even tried to do that, the impression people might get from my article about Alice. The other citation is from the end of her sojourn. There she is talking about sitting around being the Queen of France, right? She says, I'm the Queen of France. And she can use all these long words and so forth. I have no recordings of her speaking French at that point or at any point before. Wouldn't it have been such a better study if I had? If I could say, well, what does she mean by this? But I don't. Just quickly, in the qualitative literature, everywhere they go, American students, female students are harassed. They're harassed in Russia, in Argentina, they're harassed in France, they're harassed in Spain. They're harassed in Costa Rica, they're just harassed. And the young men who go with them can celebrate their own heterosexual identities as defenders of women who were raised in a country which is enlightened by gender equity. If we look at it from the perspective of the societies that are under study, we might get a different point of view. Now, this is just a brief excerpt from Marie-Claire Patron's qualitative study of French students who were on a year-long sojourn in Australia, where the gender equity, issues are kind of the same, I think, as they are here. Not exactly, but kind of. And she says, picking up, flirting, things like that, I found that really bizarre, because it's almost politically incorrect to try to pick somebody up. After a while, I said to myself, well, there must be something wrong with me. I must not be cute. I must have put on weight, because nobody's trying to pick me up. Nobody gives me any compliments. People don't even look at each other here, in fact. She says these things. According to the author, this was just as much a blow to Arlette's, identity as what the American students refer to as sexual harassment. So my suggestion is that we consider putting together studies which are collaborative, dialogic, and intercultural. That is to say, studies where we can get the perspectives of all of the parties to the things that are going on and study them. If there's a rich point, if there's something going on that is interesting, we can then figure out what it is. I also think we need work that has more focus on the meanings that students are learning, in addition to the forms. We need more true longitudinal studies. We don't have enough of those, although what counts as longitudinal and study abroad these days is getting shorter and shorter. We need more studies that examine both pragmalinguistic performance and socio-pragmatic awareness, like Maria Shardakova's study. We need to know what students mean by what they say, not just what they say. We need to know how students understand the situations that they're in, and I think that's true. We also need, and I'm seeing this now, I'm very excited to see this, we need more research on proactive learning environments, as they're called by these authors, Vanderberg, Connor Litton, and Page. We now know, and I've heard it maybe 15 times already today, we all know that this is what's required. We need we need to figure out what is the rational best way to provide support for students at different levels, in different contexts, with different learning goals. We need to think, in our research, we need to think about what the priorities of the program are that we're studying. I can't tell you how many studies I've read where at the end the author is surprised to find out that not very much second language acquisition has been going on, but they never check to see whether the program favored second language acquisition or not. So, all right, and I'm just going to end there with, I just briefly, can I say one more thing? I myself am trying to work in this way with a collaboration that I'm doing now with Dolly Tan, who is the director of the Landon in China Summer Study Abroad program for high school students. And we are looking specifically at the types of things that were in the Hashimoto study, only we're trying to collect actual data showing how the families work with the students to promote their language socialization. We have a hypothesis that the high school study abroad experience might be a little bit richer in terms of language development than the typical college experience because the families are in loco parentis and are responsible for the people who are there. We have data from all parties, the students, and the families, and the program director, and also recorded everyday interactions and notes from participant observation. And this is the question that we're going to be looking at. That's further reading, and this is my sponsor, CALPER. Thank you very much for your attention.